Under the heavy gray skies of the Himalayas, some flights never land, they simply vanish. No distress call, no wreckage, no explanation. One of them carried John Orson Nicholls, a 21-year-old flight sergeant who lifted off from Dinjan aboard Dakota MA 929 and disappeared into cloud and stone. Officially, it was an accident, but mountains do not give up their secrets easily. They keep them in silence and altitude, waiting decades for the right question to be asked. What really happened to John Orson Nicholls? Morning at Dinjan began before light had fully decided what it would become. Flight Sergeant John Orson Nicholls woke to heat already pressed against the walls, the kind that made the canvas sag and the air feel used. He lay still for a moment, listening to engines warming somewhere beyond the field, each cough and growl folding into the day's routine. This was how his body learned time now, not by clocks, but by sound. He reached for his flying logbook before his boots. The leather cover was softened at the corners, darkened where his thumb always rested. He opened it on his knees and wrote the date carefully, shaping each letter as if precision itself were a form of control. He did this every night, no matter how tired he was. If the day existed, it went into the book. That was the rule. The entry was short: route, aircraft, duty. He paused before closing it, pen hovering, then added nothing more. He had learned not to decorate these pages with thoughts. Thoughts belonged elsewhere. Outside, the airfield was already moving. Ground crew crossed the packed earth with practiced urgency. A kettle hissed near a low table, and someone poured tea into mismatched cups. Nicholls accepted one, without looking at who handed it to him. The liquid was thin, barely colored but warm. He held it with both hands, feeling the heat soak into his fingers. He drank slowly, eyes fixed on the Dakota at the edge of the strip. MA 929. He knew the aircraft's shape the way he knew his own shoulders, where it sloped, where it resisted. He had flown in her enough times to trust the engines enough times to know what they could not do. Today was another supply run. Dinjan to Fort Hertz. The route threaded mountains that rose without warning, and weather that behaved like a living thing. Usual load, someone said nearby. Nicholls nodded, though the words were not meant for him. He did the weight calculations in his head anyway, habit layered over training. Fuel, cargo, altitude, margin. With quartz, that, ujus, where. There was always a margin written and rewritten until it fit. He touched the logbook once more, before slipping it into the pocket of his jacket. The leather brushed his ribs as he moved, a small reassurance. If he was honest, it was not the book itself that mattered, but the idea that something followed him from day to day, unchanged by geography. He thought of his mother then, as he often did before flights. Gertrude Nicholls, standing on the platform at the station in winter coat, pulled tight eyes trying to memorize him. The memory arrived uninvited, sharp as cold air. She had held his hands longer than necessary, her gloves damp from snow. "You'll write," she had said. "I will," he answered, because the promise cost nothing in that moment. Now, thousands of miles from Cold Harbor, Dorsetshire, felt unreal, like a place described to him rather than lived. Yet he could still smell the wool of her coat, hear the train's hiss. That version of himself, the one who had boarded with a small case and a grin, felt close enough to touch. Nicholls finished his tea and set the cup down. It rattled once against the table. He noticed the sound, filed it away, without knowing why. The briefing was brief. Weather marginal. Mountains clear in places, buried in cloud in others. He listened without interrupting, eyes on the map laid flat between them. His finger traced the route from Dinjan northward, then east. He did not imagine trouble. He imagined work. "You ready?" the captain asked, as they walked toward the aircraft. Nicholls adjusted the strap of his jacket. "Ready," he said, and meant it. Climbing into the cockpit always felt like stepping into a role already in progress. The seat smelled of oil and sweat, familiar and grounding. He ran his checks automatically, hands moving before his mind caught up. Switches, gauges. Each one answered him back, needle, steady, light, obedient. He glanced out through the side window. The sky was pale, undecided. Heat shimmered off the ground, blurring the edges of everything. For a moment, the world looked unfinished. As engines turned over, vibration traveled through the floor, into his legs. He welcomed it. Motion meant purpose. He secured his harness, tugging it tight across his chest. The pressure was reassuring, almost intimate. There was a lull before taxi, a small pocket of waiting. In that space, a thought slipped through, uninvited and unwelcome. The mountains. He pushed it aside the way he always did. Fear was not dramatic. It was practical. It sat low in the stomach and whispered about weather, turning without warning about altitudes that left little room for error. He acknowledged it, then folded it away. The day did not allow for more. As the aircraft began to move, Nicholls felt the familiar pull forward. Dinjan slid past in fragments, men waving a line of trees, dust lifting behind the wheels. He focused on the panel on numbers, behaving as expected. After this, he had written to his mother weeks earlier. "I want to study engineering properly. Learn how these machines really think." He smiled faintly at the memory of the sentence. Machines did not think. They obeyed or they failed. People were more complicated. The takeoff roll pressed him back into the seat. The engines roared steady and strong. Then the ground released them. The sensation was always the same, and always different the moment when weight surrendered to air. He watched Dinjan fall away, flatten, disappear. Cloud thickened ahead. The aircraft climbed engines, laboring slightly as altitude increased. Nicholls adjusted settings, eyes flicking between instruments. He said little. Words were unnecessary here. As they entered the mountains, the temperature shifted. Cold seeped in through seams he could not see. The windshield showed a world reduced to gray and white edges softened. He leaned closer, as if proximity could sharpen what he saw. Somewhere below, rivers cut paths through forest. Somewhere ahead, Fort Hertz waited isolated and expectant. The route was familiar, but familiarity did not breed comfort. It bred vigilance. Nicholls thought again of his logbook tucked against him. Tonight, he would write the return time. That was the plan. Plans mattered. They were quiet agreements with the future. He adjusted his headset and spoke, voice calm, holding steady. The engines answered with their constant rhythm. The aircraft pressed on, carrying fuel, cargo, and 6 lives into narrowing space. I cannot say whether Nicholls sensed the day bending away from him. What I know is this: he did what he always did. He checked. He adjusted. He trusted the machine and the training that had brought him here. Somewhere between Dinjan and the mountains beyond, a routine flight carried the full weight of everything he had promised and everything he had yet to become. The aircraft did not return on schedule. That fact arrived quietly, almost politely, slipping into the afternoon without alarm. At Dinjan, Flight Sergeant John Orson Nicholls was expected back by a certain hour, a time written in pencil on a board already smudged by other names and other routes. When the minute passed, no one moved to erase it. Delay was ordinary. Weather was fickle. Mountains made their own decisions. The engines of other aircraft came and went. Dust rose, settled, rose again. Nicholls' logbook stayed closed, its next line empty. By evening, someone checked the radio logs again. Frequencies were scanned with care that bordered on ritual. There had been nothing. No clip transmission. No broken phrase. The operator leaned back, rubbed his eyes, and wrote a short note that said only that MA 929 had not called in. Night brought cooler air and a different kind of waiting. Nicholls had always said the worst part of flying was not turbulence, but the hours after landing, when the body refused to stand down. That night, his absence kept others awake instead. The chair beside the radio desk remained empty, pushed slightly back, as if someone had just stood up. Morning sharpened concern into procedure. The commanding officer read through the flight details, again finger moving line by line. Route Dinjan to Fort Hertz. Cargo fuel and supplies. Crew 6. He paused at Nicholls' name, not because it stood out, but because it did not. 21. Second pilot. Competent. Reliable. The kind of man whose presence rarely demanded comment. Search aircraft lifted off as soon as weather allowed. They flew the expected path first, eyes straining for anything out of place. White cloud wrapped the ridgelines, revealing nothing, then everything, then nothing again. The pilots knew what wreckage looked like from the air. They knew how even a large aircraft could be reduced to fragments indistinguishable from stone. They saw none of it. Reports came back in pieces. Heavy cloud. Poor visibility. No sign. Each phrase landed with weight. Nicholls' name traveled with those reports, tied now to a growing file. Someone mentioned Kamku, a sighting half-certain offered by a Hudson crew who believed they had seen a Dakota climbing course, roughly correct altitude marginal. The words were written down, underlined once. Kamku became a point, then a hope. Maps were unfolded again, their creases deepened by use. Fingers traced valleys, imagined paths. Nicholls had once joked that maps lied by omission. They showed lines, but not effort. They did not show the way cloud pressed against glass, or how engines sounded different when air thinned. That memory surfaced now in someone else's voice, retold without humor. Days passed. Search patterns widened and thinned as fuel and daylight imposed their own limits. The mountains remained unmoved. At Dinjan Ma, 929's parking space stayed empty, its outline slowly forgotten by the dust. Paperwork advanced where aircraft could not. A report was drafted, revised, signed. It stated that the crew was missing following an operational flight. It listed Nicholls among them, his rank typed carefully, his service number exact. Precision survived where certainty did not. The phrase "presumed killed" entered the record with administrative calm. It did not describe an event. It closed a door. In England, Gertrude Nicholls opened the letter at the small table near the window. Winter light lay thin across the wood. She read the words twice, then a third time, as if repetition might alter their meaning. There was no place listed, no explanation. Only time reduced to a date and possibility reduced to a sentence. "I told you the weather worried me," John had said, once standing by the fire, voice low so his father would not hear. She heard it now, as if spoken again, the memory clear and unhelpful. She folded the letter neatly and placed it beside the others he had sent. They were tied with ribbon, a habit she had adopted without thinking. The paper felt the same. The ink looked the same. Only the tone had changed from familiar handwriting to official print. At Dinjan, Nicholls' effects were inventoried. Jacket, logbook, a pencil worn short. The leather cover was noted, then set aside. The book was not opened. There was no instruction for that. Objects were meant to be catalogued, not consulted. The commanding officer signed another document, this one heavier in consequence. He had known Nicholls only in passing. He remembered a steady voice, a nod of acknowledgement. Writing his name now felt disproportionate to the act, as if ink were being asked to do too much. "I'm sorry," he said aloud, though no one was in the room. Search efforts ceased officially, after a time measured not by hope, but by regulation. Aircraft were reassigned. Fuel was rationed. New names appeared on the board. The route to Fort Hertz continued, flown again and again by others who avoided looking too long at certain ridges. Nicholls' world narrowed to records and remembrance. His name was carved later, far from Dinjan, in a place meant for those without marked ground. The stone was cool and precise, its letters uniform. Visitors passed, some pausing, most moving on. Few knew his age. Fewer still knew about the logbook or the way he drank weak tea with both hands. I cannot pretend that this period held drama. It held waiting, and then it held paperwork. It held a hope that thinned without announcing itself. The loss of John Orson Nicholls did not arrive as a single blow. It unfolded as a series of decisions made by people who never saw his face at altitude, who never heard the engines change tone as cloud thickened. What remained was a gap that records could not fill, a space between departure and conclusion that stayed open for decades. His final flight did not end. It simply stopped being observed. The mountains kept their shape. Dinjan kept its routines. And somewhere between them, a young man's path ended without witness, leaving those who knew his name to live with a story interrupted, not resolved. Clayton Cools did not begin with John Orson Nicholls. He began with paper. Old reports lay spread across a wide table, their edges softened by decades of handling. Ink had faded to a brownish gray, but the language remained firm, clipped, confident in ways that felt undeserved. Dates repeated. Aircraft types blurred together. Routes overlapped until they lost meaning. Yet one file kept drawing his attention, not because it was detailed, but because it was thin. MA 929. A single supply flight. No return. A last sighting recorded near Kamku. Cools circled the place name with a pencil, then stopped. He had learned to distrust anything that resolved itself too neatly. Kamku appeared in too many reports, often when certainty ran out. It was a placeholder, disguised as a location. He leaned forward and read the line again slowly. Believed to be seen. Approximate position. The phrasing hesitated. Wartime language often did, when no one wanted to admit they did not know. "This doesn't hold," Cools said quietly to no one. He unfolded a paper map and smoothed it with both hands. He preferred paper. Screens hid scale. Paper demanded it. He traced the route from Dinjan toward Fort Hertz, following the line with his finger, pausing, where mountains rose sharply and valleys collapsed into one another. He imagined altitude not as a number, but as effort. Air thinning, engines laboring, human judgment narrowing under pressure. John Orson Nicholls had been 21 years old. That fact stayed with Kulas as he worked, though he did not yet understand why. 21 was not an abstraction. It was an age of confidence built on limited evidence. Kulas pictured a young man in a cockpit trusting instruments that were never meant to tell the whole truth. He pinned a photograph of a Dakota above his desk. The aircraft looked solid, almost generous. People often forgot how little margin such machines truly had in mountains. Forgiveness disappeared quietly, without drama. The Comcu report continued to bother him. The supposed sighting placed MA9 9 dozens of miles, south of where the terrain would later prove unforgiving. In open country, such an error might mean little. In the Mishmi Hills, it meant everything. Kulas began to look beyond archives. He spoke to people who had never written reports. Villagers, hunters, guides whose knowledge came from movement, not maps. He listened through translators, watching hands more than faces. There was a big bird, one man said, pointing with his chin toward the north. Long ago, broken on the mountain. Kulas felt something tighten in his chest. He asked how far, how high. The answers were imprecise, but consistent. North, higher. Always higher than Kamku. Back at his table, Kulas returned to the name. John Orson Nicholls. He said it aloud once carefully, as if testing whether it belonged in the room. Names mattered. They gave wreckage direction. Without them, debris stayed anonymous. He reviewed the load manifest again. Fuel, supplies, dangerous weight. If something went wrong, there would be no gradual failure, no chance to recover. The aircraft would not drift down. It would stop. Planning the expedition took months. Permissions were requested, denied, requested again. Weather windows opened briefly, then closed. Kulas assembled a small team who understood restraint. This was not a race. It was an approach. They traveled light but deliberately. Kulas carried copies of the original wartime reports folded until their creases softened. He wanted the past physically present, not abstracted. As they moved into the hills, air thinned and sound changed. Footsteps felt louder, breathing closer. Sweat cooled quickly at rest. Kulas noticed how his thoughts narrowed as physical effort took over. Speculation gave way to placement, balance, direction. He imagined Nicholls here, not as he had been alive, but as momentum carried forward into rock and slope. The idea was not sentimental. It was mechanical. Gravity had done what gravity always did. The guide stopped often, scanning the ground, listening. Birds scattered from branches. Water moved unseen beneath stone. Kulas adjusted his pack and wiped sweat from his neck. The climb was steady, unforgiving. On the 5th day, terrain began to feel wrong. Debris altered landscapes subtly. It interrupted patterns. Kulas' slowed eyes trained on shapes that resisted explanation. Metal caught the light first. Not bright, dull, burned, curved in a way stone never was. Then another fragment half buried. Blackened edges. Unmistakable. He dropped to one knee, hand hovering just above the surface. The metal felt cold, even in sunlight. He did not touch it yet. "This is it," he said softly. The team spread out, careful not to disturb anything. An engine component lay downslope, its form still legible despite decades of exposure. Kulas photographed everything, methodically, angles chosen for later verification. He found stamped markings partially obscured by corrosion. He copied them slowly, checking each character twice. MA929. He sat back, breath briefly visible in the thin air. Around him lay the conclusion of a flight that had never been closed. The mountain did not react. It did not need to. For the first time since beginning the search, Kulas thought clearly of John Orson Nicholls as a person rather than a case. A young man who had planned to study engineering, who had kept a logbook not because he was told to, but because continuity mattered to him. The distance between that intention and this slope felt immense. "We found them," Kulas said later into the radio. He did not list names yet. Precision came before announcement. The wreckage spoke plainly. The aircraft had been flying, not falling. The angle of impact suggested control until the final second. Kulas followed the debris field, noting its spread, its violence. There were no signs of attack, no punctures, no intrusion. Only direction, speed, and sudden contact. Night arrived early at altitude. Cold settled fast. Kulas lay awake listening to wind slide along the ridge. He thought about the years between 1943 and now, about how easily time hid what terrain protected. Morning brought frost along the grass. Kulas packed carefully, checking list twice. Responsibility outweighed fatigue. This was not discovery for curiosity. This was correction. As they descended, the maps folded again, now altered by truth. Kamku remained marked, but it no longer carried authority. A new location existed, earned through effort and restraint. For John Orson Nicholls, the flight now had a place. The mountains had returned what they could, location, not mercy. I cannot say this discovery softened the loss. What it did was interrupt the long drift of speculation. It placed an ending where an ending belonged. Kulas had done what he set out to do, pull a young man out of administrative limbo and return him to the physical world. The rest would come slowly. Verification. Notifications. The careful work of fitting truth into lives shaped by waiting. The slope did not look dramatic at first glance. It rose steadily, covered in low brush and stone, its summit hidden behind a curtain of shifting cloud. Yet, Clayton Kulas felt the weight of finality as soon as he stood within the debris field. This was not a place of survival. It was a place where motion had ended abruptly. The aircraft had struck the mountain while still flying. That conclusion did not arrive as theory. It emerged from angles, distances, and the way metal had been torn rather than folded. Kulas moved slowly, documenting before touching, letting the ground speak first. He followed the debris trail upward step by careful step until the pattern became undeniable. The impact point lay just below the ridgeline. Only a few dozen meters higher, the terrain dropped away sharply on the far side. The Dakota had been climbing engines, working nose slightly raised. It had almost cleared the obstacle. Almost. Kulas stopped where fragments of wing were embedded into rock. The aluminum peeled back as if by forceful hands. The metal bore the scars of heat and violence, but not of explosion before impact. Fire had come after, fed by fuel and cargo, not before. That distinction mattered. He imagined the cockpit in those final seconds, not with drama, but with sequence. Instrument steady, altitude insufficient, cloud masking the true shape of the mountain, a ridge appearing too late to negotiate. No time for radio calls. No space for error. John Orson Nicholls would have been watching the panel, calling numbers, monitoring climb. Second pilot was not a passive role. It required vigilance, anticipation, correction. Kulas pictured him leaning forward slightly, eyes flicking between gauges and windshield, voice measured. Powers holding, he might have said. The thought settled heavily. Kulas knelt beside an engine fragment. Its casing split open, internal components frozen in a position they had held for decades. He traced the damage with his eyes, noting compression patterns. The propeller blades were bent backward, not shattered. They had been turning at impact. Controlled flight. The mountain had not reached up to snatch the aircraft. The aircraft had flown into it. The team measured elevation carefully. The site sat above 10,000 feet higher than many expected, based on wartime assumptions. At that altitude, cold ruled even in daylight. In winter months, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Kulas considered the conditions on the day of the flight: moist air, cloud, likely icing. Icing did not announce itself loudly. It accumulated silently, changing the shape of wings, stealing lift bit by bit. Pilots fought it with power and altitude, sometimes winning, sometimes not. Kulas knew the signs. He had seen them before. If MA929 had encountered severe icing, its climb performance would have degraded, gradually, deceptively. Instruments would not scream danger. They would lie by omission. Kulas followed the debris downslope. The spread was wide, violent. Fire had burned hot, fed by fuel drums meant for Fort Hertz. That cargo explained the condition of what remained. It also explained why nothing had been visible from the air during early searches. Fire consumed evidence quickly. The jungle reclaimed the rest. There were no signs of combat, no perforations consistent with gunfire, no debris patterns suggesting mid-air failure. The story was technical, not hostile. As Kulas documented the site, he felt the difference between solving a problem and confronting an ending. Reconstruction answered how, not what it cost. The mountain offered facts, not mercy. He thought of Nicholls' fear of mountain weather, a detail gleaned from letters and recollections. Fear did not mean hesitation. It meant awareness. The irony sat heavily with Kulas. Awareness did not always grant escape. The team worked methodically, voices low. Each fragment was photographed, described, left in place. This was not recovery in the physical sense. It was identification. Confirmation. permission for truth to move forward. Kulas paused near what had once been the cockpit area. There was little left to distinguish it now, but he knew where it had been by the distribution of debris. He stood still, pack straps creaking softly, and allowed himself a moment of acknowledgement. John Orson Nicholls had ended here, not in abstraction, not in paperwork, but against stone and cloud, doing exactly what he had been trained to do. The mountain did not care. But people did. Night fell quickly. The temperature dropped with it. Kulas wrote notes by headlamp breath, visible fingers stiff. He recorded conclusions cautiously, avoiding final language until every detail aligned. The next morning, frost coated metal fragments, making them gleam briefly in the sun. Kulas reviewed the site once more, walking its edges, ensuring nothing had been overlooked. Forensic work demanded restraint. Emotion blurred accuracy. By the time they prepared to leave, the picture was clear. MA-929 had not been lost to attack. It had not vanished inexplicably. It had flown into terrain under control, likely compromised by weather and icing. Its margin erased minute by minute until nothing remained to trade for altitude. For John Orson Nicholls, this meant his final actions were not confusion or panic but effort. Correction. Persistence. Kulas packed his notebooks carefully. The mountain receded behind them. As they descended, its shape unchanged. It had kept its secret for decades, not through malice, but through scale and isolation. I cannot say that knowing the mechanics of this ending makes it easier. But it replaces speculation with sequence. It allows a young man's final moments to be understood not as disappearance, but as conclusion. The flight did not fade away. It ended here against this ridge in cold air and cloud. And for the first time since 1943, that ending could be placed, named, and carried forward. Once the technical conclusions settled into place, something else began to surface, slower, heavier, and harder to categorize. The reconstruction had explained how the flight ended. It did not explain what the ending meant to the person who had lived forward into it. For Clayton Kulas, this was the moment when wreckage stopped being evidence and became consequence. John Orson Nicholls was no longer a file marked unresolved. He was no longer suspended in that peculiar wartime limbo between departure and assumption. The discovery on the mountain did not soften the loss, but it changed its posture. It allowed his life to lean forward into an ending, instead of trailing off into paperwork. The absence of combat mattered more than anyone had expected. For decades, families of the missing had lived with multiple imagined endings, none of them anchored. Enemy fire, capture. A slow death in isolation. Each possibility carried its own cruelty. The confirmation that MA-929 had not been attacked removed an entire category of fear. What remained was not easier, but it was simpler. John Orson Nicholls had not been surprised by violence. He had not been overrun. He had been doing his job. That distinction mattered deeply because it returned agency to his final minutes. Agency did not mean control. It meant participation. It meant that his end was shaped by decisions, training, and effort, not helplessness. In the quiet language of the report, Kulas described controlled flight into terrain. Behind those words lay a sequence that could be imagined without embellishment. The Dakota climbing. Powers set carefully. Instruments read and reread. Weather closing in without warning. A ridge concealed until distance collapsed. No time for radio calls. No space for alternatives. John would have been watching the panel. He would have been calling numbers, checking climb rate, monitoring airspeed, as ice accumulated invisibly along the wings. Second pilot did not mean second responsibility. It meant shared vigilance. Somewhere between cloud layers, a calculation stopped working. Kulas thought often about John's fear of mountain weather. It appeared in letters and small remarks preserved by memory. Fear was not weakness. It was familiarity. Those who feared weather respected it. They did not challenge it casually. They adjusted to it, worked within it, trusted their preparation to hold. In that sense, John Orson Nicholls had died as he had lived his service life, aware, cautious, engaged. Back in Dorsetshire, the truth arrived long after the people who first waited for it. Gertrude Nicholls had not lived to hear the word found. She had lived with missing. That word had shaped the rest of her days quietly, without ceremony. She had never been able to picture where her son ended. The world for her had always stopped midair. What remained were habits. Letters kept in order. A drawer never cleared. His name spoken carefully, never casually. There was no anniversary to mark. No place to go. The confirmation, when it finally came to surviving relatives, carried both relief and grief in equal measure. Relief that the story now had shape. Grief that shape did not include survival. Some wanted to know everything. Some wanted only the outline. The truth allowed both. The record changed quietly. A clerk updated a line. A classification shifted. From missing to found, from presumed to confirmed. These changes did not announce themselves. They entered the world the way all bureaucratic truths did, without ceremony but with permanence. John's name remained on the Singapore Memorial. That did not change. What changed was the knowledge behind the name. It no longer floated unanchored. It belonged to a specific slope in the Mishmi Hills, at a height where air thinned and mistakes multiplied. The human truth did not contradict the technical truth. It lived inside it. John Orson Nicholls had planned a future. He had written about studying engineering, about wanting to understand aircraft beyond operation, to learn how they failed and why. That ambition mattered now. In retrospect, he had trusted machines, but never blindly. He had wanted to know their limits. In the end, those limits defined his last moment. The aircraft did not betray him. It reached the edge of what it could do. There was no prolonged suffering. The impact had been immediate. The fire that followed left little intact. This knowledge, harsh as it was, mattered. It replaced imagined endurance with swift finality. It spared loved ones from picturing drawn-out fear. Human truth is often unkind in its clarity, but clarity is a form of respect. Koulas understood this when he finalized his findings. He did not add narrative. He did not speculate beyond evidence. He knew that families would supply enough imagination on their own. His responsibility was to narrow the field, not widen it. John Orson Nicholls was not lost anymore. He was located. He was accounted for. He was no longer an absence defined by uncertainty, but a life concluded by circumstance. I cannot say that knowing these facts would have eased his mother's waiting had she lived to hear them, but I can say that uncertainty is a heavier burden than truth. Uncertainty demands endless interpretation. Truth allows grief to rest, even if it never fully settles. The story of MA929 no longer required heroic framing. It required acknowledgement. 6 people flew into conditions that narrowed until there was no margin left. They did not vanish. They arrived at an ending no one could reach for decades. For John Orson Nicholls, that ending now had dignity. It recognized his competence, his awareness, and his presence in the final sequence of events. It did not reduce him to a symbol or elevate him into myth. It left him human. And in that humanity, something essential returned. The flight was no longer a question. It was a story, with a last page written not in speculation but in fact. What remained of John Orson Nicholls did not take the form people expect when they hear the word found. There was no return flight, no procession, no transfer of remains across oceans. What arrived instead was precision. A location fixed to terrain. A set of coordinates that no longer drifted. A sentence that replaced decades of conditional language with something firm enough to stand on. For most of his life after the war, John had existed in family memory as motion without landing. He was always the young man leaving the figure framed by a train window, the voice promising to write. That image had endured because nothing ever replaced it. Waiting had become a habit practiced, even when no one admitted they were still doing it. The discovery in the Mishmi Hills ended that habit abruptly. In Dorsetshire, the news reached the family quietly. No uniformed messenger. No dramatic knock. Just an envelope passed from one pair of hands to another, opened at a table that had held meals, letters, and ordinary life for generations. The paper was thin. The words were careful. They named a place no one there had ever seen. A younger relative read it aloud, then stopped. "So that's where he is," she said. The sentence felt strange as soon as it was spoken. Is not was. No one corrected her. No one needed to. For years, the family had lived without a direction for their grief. There had been no sight to imagine, no landscape to attach memory to. John had been everywhere and nowhere at once. Now there was a slope, a ridge, a height where the air thinned and the cold never truly left. The geography did not comfort, but it clarified. They gathered his things again, as they had done before, though this time with a different attention. Letters were unfolded carefully. Envelopes checked for dates. A photograph passed from hand to hand. In one image, John leaned against a railing cap, pushed back slightly, eyes narrowed against light. He looked younger than his age, or perhaps simply unburdened by what lay ahead. Among the papers was a small detail no record had ever captured. A folded note, separate from the letters he sent home. It was written in his hand, not addressed to anyone. A list of calculations, fuel margins, weight estimates. The back of the page carried a brief line, almost an afterthought. Remember to slow down when writing. His sister had kept the note without knowing why. Now she understood. John liked order. He liked clarity. He believed care showed itself in small acts. They placed the note beside his pen, the one he had carried before the war. The pen was heavier than modern ones, its metal dulled by years of disuse. When lifted, it pulled slightly at the fingers. It demanded intention. That too felt like him. For decades, the Singapore Memorial had been the only physical acknowledgement of his end. His name was carved with precision, aligned with others whose stories had also been cut short. Visitors read it without knowing where his path had finally stopped. The stone offered respect, but not resolution. Now, resolution existed elsewhere. There would be no marker placed in the Mishmi Hills. The terrain made such gestures impractical, almost disrespectful. The mountain did not want symbols. It accepted only weather and time. But knowing the place altered how the memorial felt. The carved name no longer pointed into open space. It pointed towards something real. He flew until he couldn't, an older family member said one evening, voice steady. Yes, another answered. That sounds like him. The exchange carried no dramatics. It did not need them. It aligned with everything they knew about John, his methodical habits, his quiet seriousness, his belief that effort mattered even when outcome was uncertain. A local archivist updated a record months later. The change was small, almost invisible, to anyone not looking for it. A note added. A classification adjusted. The archivist included one additional detail, newly uncovered from family correspondence. John had intended to apply for an engineering course upon returning to England. He had already written to inquire about requirements. That detail traveled outward slowly, finding its way into footnotes, then into short biographies. It mattered because it restored direction to a life often remembered only at its end. John Orson Nicholls had not been defined by his disappearance. He had been moving toward something. At a remembrance gathering held long after the discovery, there was no formal program. People stood with cups of tea, speaking softly. A photograph of John rested on a small table, weighted at the corners. Someone read one of his letters, choosing one without complaint or bravado. "The weather's been difficult," the letter said, "but I'm learning to read it better." The room was quiet as the words settled. Outside wind moved through bare branches, producing a sound that felt familiar grounding. What remained now was not uncertainty, but responsibility. Responsibility to remember accurately, to avoid embellishment, to let John be what he had been, a young man attentive to detail, cautious, but willing, carrying plans he would never complete. I cannot claim that this knowledge healed anyone, but it replaced a shapeless ache with something defined. Defined loss is not lighter, but it is bearable. It allows memory to arrange itself instead of scattering endlessly. Somewhere far from Dorsetshire, the ridge remains exactly as it was. Cloud lifts briefly, then settles again. Wind moves along the slope with steady purpose. Metal fragments dull further under frost, and sun edges softening year by year. When I think of what remains of John Orson Nicholls, I do not picture ceremony or stone. I picture his leather-bound logbook open to its final page, the pencil aligned carefully along the margin. His handwriting slowing, just as he preferred, while cold gathers on the windshield and the mountain rises ahead close enough to touch fixed forever in the place where the last line was, never written. John Orson Nicholls is still named on the Singapore Memorial, his letters cut cleanly into stone, unchanged by what was learned decades later. Visitors pass, some pausing, some not reading. A name that once floated without a place, now it does not. The flight from Dinjan did not vanish. It ended. It ended on a ridge in the Mishmi Hills, high enough that cloud still decides what can be seen and what must wait. The mountain keeps no record of rank or intention. It only keeps position. For a long time, John existed only as a departure and a sentence that followed it. Missing, presumed. Those words carried him nowhere. Now, they have been replaced by geography, by altitude, by a final point that does not move. I cannot pretend this knowledge closes the story. It does not return the young man who drank weak tea before flying, who kept his logbook neat, who planned a future he would never reach. But it changes the silence he left behind. It gives it edges. Somewhere wind still moves across that slope. Frost still forms on metal when cloud lifts, at dawn. Nothing there remembers his name, but we do. What lingers is not the crash nor the years of waiting, but the simple fact that a life once suspended has been allowed to land. A flight unaccounted for has been placed back into the world. John Orson Nicholls did not disappear. He arrived at an ending no one could reach for a long time. And now at last that ending can be spoken aloud.